Published, 3:07 Eastern Daylight Saving Time, the 29th of March 2019. Updated, 4:55 Eastern Daylight Saving Time, the 29th of March 2019. An anti-stall system on board the Boeing 737 MAX which crashed in Ethiopia killing 157 people was activated before it plunged from the sky. Investigators believe the troubled system is now the prime suspect in two fatal Boeing crashes, after a Lion Air jet plunged into the ocean in Indonesia in October last year, killing 189. The news comes as investigators review data from two black boxes that were on board the Ethiopian jet, with a preliminary report expected as early as next week. An anti-stall system fitted to new Boeing 737 MAX jets was activated shortly before the Ethiopia Airlines crash earlier this month. Sources say investigators made the discovery while looking at data from the plane's two black box recorders, and are due to issue a report in the coming weeks. Ethiopia Airlines Flight 302 crashed on March 10 shortly after taking off from Addis Ababa. Meanwhile, it was revealed that American and European regulators knew that the MCAS anti-stall feature might malfunction in conditions similar to the Lion Air and Ethiopia Airlines crashes. Despite that, the European Aviation and Space Agency (EASA) certified the plane as safe in part because it said additional procedures and training would clearly explain to pilots the unusual situations in which the system might not work. The EASA certification document, available online, did list those situations, but a flight manual taken from an American Airlines plane and seen by Reuters did not. EASA and the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) ultimately determined that setup was safe enough for the plane to be certified. In the Lion Air crash, flight conditions when the plane came down were similar to those described in the EASA document. While the exact conditions faced by the Ethiopia Airlines pilots have not been revealed, they are believed to be similar. The EASA document specifically noted that at speeds greater than 230 knots, 265 miles per hour, 425 kilometers per hour, with flaps retracted, pilots might have to use the wheel in the cockpit's center console rather than an electric thumb switch on the control yoke. EASA and the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) ultimately determined that setup was safe enough for the plane to be certified, with the European agency citing training plans and the relative rarity of conditions requiring the trimmed wheel. The regulator said simulations showed the electric thumb switches could not keep the 737 MAX properly trimmed under certain conditions, including those at the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines crashes, according to the Indonesian preliminary report and a source with knowledge of the Ethiopian air traffic control recordings. The trim system adjusts the angle of the nose. If the nose is too far up, the jet risks entering a stall. Additional procedures and training needed to clearly explain when the manual wheel might be needed, according to the document. The EASA spokesman said that was a reference to the Boeing Flight Crew Operations Manual. An American Airlines Group Inc. flight manual for 737 MAX pilots dated October 2017 said the thumb switches had less ability to move the nose than the manual wheel. All 157 passengers and crew on board Flight 302 were killed in the crash on March 10. The same anti-stall system was active before another 737 MAX jet owned by Lion Air plunged into the ocean in October last year, killing 189. The manual, which is 1,400 pages long, did not specify the flight conditions in which the wheel might be needed. The trim wheel is a relic of the Boeing 737's 1960s origins and does not appear in more modern planes like the 787 and Airbus SEA 350. It is not often used. Several current and former 737 pilots told Reuters, "It would be very unusual to use the trimmed wheel in flight. I have only used manual trim once in the simulator," said a 737 pilot. "It is not physically easy to make large trim changes to correct, say, an MCAS input." You, or more than likely the other pilot, have to flip out a little handle and wind, much like a boat winch. The EASA document said that after flight testing, the FAA's Transport Airplane Directorate, which oversees design approvals and modifications, was concerned about whether the 737 MAX system complied with regulations because the thumb switches could not control trim on their own in all conditions. FAA declined to comment on the European document. A trim-related, equivalent level of safety, ELOS memorandum listed in its 737 MAX certification document is not available on the FAA website. The agency declined to provide it to Reuters. The night before the Lion Air crash, different pilots on the same plane faced a similar problem with MCAS and tried to use electric trim to counteract it, according to the preliminary report from Indonesian investigators. After the third time MCAS forced a nose down, the first officer commented that the control column was too heavy to hold back to counter the automated movements, the preliminary report said. Former FAA accident investigator Mike Daniels said that to prevent stalls, the control column was designed to require more force for a pilot to pull back than to push forward. Boeing on Wednesday said software changes to MCAS would provide additional layers of protection, including making it impossible for the system to keep the flight crew from counteracting it. On the 737 MAX, Boeing removed the yoke jerk function that enabled pilots to disable the automated trim system with a hard pull on the control column rather than hitting two cutout switches on the center console. In a blog post on his personal website, former Boeing engineer Peter Lemmy said that could make things harder for a pilot in a crisis. In the scenario where the stabilizer is running away nose down, the pilot may only fixate on pulling the column back in response, he said. They may not be mentally capable to trim back or cut out the trim. Instead, they just keep pulling. Ultimately, the crew the evening before the Lion Air crash stopped the automated nose-down movement with the cutout switches and used the wheel to control trim for the remainder of the flight, the preliminary report said. That was the proper procedure to deal with a runaway stabilizer, according to Boeing. All 737 MAX jets, Boeing's fastest-selling model, have been grounded around the world until a fix for the problem can be manufactured. However, current and former pilots told Reuters that the way the trim wheel and other controls behaved in practice compared with in training may have confused the Lion Air crews, who were also dealing with warnings about unreliable airspeed and altitude. MCAS activation produces conditions similar to a runaway trim, but the training is not done with a stick shaker active and multiple other failures, which make the diagnosis much more difficult, said John Cox, an aviation safety consultant and former commercial pilot. The stick shaker alerts pilots to a potential stall by vibrating the control column. Boeing's fastest-selling 737 MAX jet, with orders worth more than $500 billion at list prices, has been grounded globally by the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and other regulators, although airlines are still allowed to fly them without passengers to move planes to other airports. The manufacturer said it had developed a training package that 737 MAX pilots are required to take before the worldwide ban can be lifted, proposing as it did before two deadly crashes that those pilots do not need time on flight simulators to safely operate the aircraft. On Thursday, a lawsuit against Boeing was filed in Chicago federal court by the family of Jackson Musoni, a citizen of Rwanda, who died in the Ethiopian Airlines crash. The lawsuit alleges that Boeing had defectively designed the automated flight control system. Boeing said it could not comment on the lawsuit. The amount and quality of training that Boeing and airlines provided to 737 MAX pilots is one of the issues under scrutiny as investigators around the world try to determine the causes of two 737 MAX crashes within 5 months. The U.S. Department of Justice is investigating Boeing's development process and what Boeing disclosed about MCAS, U.S. Transportation Department said on Monday that a new Blue Ribbon Commission will review how the Federal Aviation Administration certifies new aircraft. U.S. and European regulators knew at least 2 years before the Indonesian crash that the usual method for controlling the 737 MAX's nose angle might not work in conditions similar to those in two recent disasters, Reuters reported on Friday, citing a document. The European Aviation and Space Agency (EASA) certified the plane as safe in part because it said additional procedures and training would clearly explain to pilots the unusual situations in which they would need to manipulate a rarely used manual wheel to control, or trim, the plane's angle. Those situations, however, were not listed in the flight manual, according to a copy from American Airlines seen by Reuters. Boeing declined to comment on the EASA document.